Why would a billionaire grandfather leave his favorite grandson nothing but a single plane ticket? Why send me to Rome, of all places, while everyone else got yachts and companies? The answer waited for me behind one quiet iron gate outside the city, a truth he'd hidden from everyone but me. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I never thought my grandfather's funeral would feel like a stage show. People whispered when I walked into the chapel that morning, the marble floor reflecting their polished shoes and practiced grief. Mercer family funerals were less about mourning and more about being seen. Black suits, designer sunglasses, whispered networking, nothing left to chance. I sat near the back, away from the cluster of cousins who had all inherited my grandfather's charisma but none of his restraint. Grandfather, Edward Mercer, had built his empire from nothing: construction, logistics, real estate, then international holdings. At his peak, he was worth close to $1 billion. To the family, his death was tragic, but to most of them, it was also an event. The day the old lion finally left the den, and the cubs could start fighting over the bones. I wasn't like them. I was the quiet one, the architect who'd tried to make his own way instead of joining Mercer Holdings. I'd started a small design firm 5 years ago. It folded 2 years later after one bad investor and a pandemic delay. The others never let me forget it. When the organ stopped and the priest said the final amen, the family gathered near the casket. The smell of lilies was heavy, cloying. My Uncle Robert was the first to speak, voice loud enough to make sure the cameras caught it. He was a visionary, my father, taught us that ambition is the only true morality. I remembered my grandfather teaching me something different, that legacy isn't built from ambition alone, but from the way you treat the people who can't give you anything back. Robert squeezed a tear from one eye and gestured for his son, Brandon, to join him. Brandon had the Mercer look. Perfect hair, expensive watch, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He'd inherited my grandfather's yacht 2 years before Edward even died. The rumor was, he used it mostly for parties. When the speeches ended, we moved to the mansion for the reading of the will. It was the kind of home that didn't feel like one. Columns taller than trees, portraits staring down like they were waiting for someone to impress them. The entire family gathered in the grand dining hall, now cleared of its usual formal table and replaced by rows of chairs. The lawyer, Mr. Alden, looked small behind a stack of files. His voice trembled slightly as he announced, "This is the last will and testament of Edward Mercer, signed and sealed 6 months prior to his passing." Everyone leaned forward. Robert and Lillian, the eldest children, received controlling shares of Mercer Holdings. Expected. Brandon got the penthouse apartment downtown and a sizable trust. My cousin Elise got the yacht, the Silver Hour. Each name brought a wave of polite clapping and fake congratulations. Then Alden cleared his throat. "And to Daniel Mercer." A pause. I could hear a few chuckles already. My grandson, who, though he chose a different path, has always reminded me of what integrity costs in a world that has forgotten it. I leave the contents of a small envelope, which I instructed be handed to him personally. There was a flicker of confusion, then laughter. Actual laughter. Alden nodded toward me. An assistant handed over a thin, crumpled envelope, the kind used for letters rather than legal papers. I stood up slowly, took it, and sat back down. Brandon whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Guess Grandpa wanted to make sure you had cab fare home." Laughter rippled across the room. My Aunt Lillian shook her head, trying to hide a smile. I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was one item, a single plane ticket. Economy class. Destination, Rome, Italy. The laughter grew louder. Someone muttered, "Maybe he wanted you to find yourself." Another added, "Hope it's round trip. Wouldn't want him stranded." I looked at the ticket for a long time. The paper was creased, worn, as if it had been handled many times before being sealed. There was no note, no explanation, just the ticket and my name printed clearly on it. I didn't say a word. I folded the envelope carefully and placed it inside my jacket pocket. Robert clapped me on the shoulder as we filed out. "Don't take it too hard, Danny. The old man had a sense of humor. Maybe you'll find some peace in Rome, eh?" I met his eyes. "Maybe." In the foyer, cameras flashed as relatives posed near portraits of Edward, pretending to grieve for reporters. I caught my reflection in one of the mirrors, same dark suit, same family resemblance. But my eyes didn't look like theirs. Mine didn't flicker with calculation. After the reporters left, I found a quiet spot near the garden window. My grandmother's old roses had withered, untended, since her death. I used to help her prune them when I was 10. Grandfather would stand nearby with a cigar, giving advice about patience. how some things grew only when you stopped forcing them. A small movement caught my attention. Mr. Alden, the lawyer, was approaching again. He spoke softly, away from the crowd. "Mr. Mercer, your grandfather left specific instructions that the envelope be opened today, but the purpose of the ticket will become clear only when you arrive. He said you'd understand." "Understand what?" I asked. Alden hesitated. He used the words, "Tell him the foundation begins in Rome." That's all I was told. The foundation. The word stirred something in memory. Sketches I'd made years ago with my grandfather. Rough outlines for an architectural project he said we'd build together someday. I'd assumed he was just being kind to a boy who liked drawing. I nodded. "Thank you." When I stepped outside, cold air hit my face. My relatives were still laughing near the cars. I could hear Brandon's voice, loud as always. "Guess we know who the favorite wasn't," Robert chuckled. "Maybe the boy will finally learn how the world works." I walked past them without a word. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. International code, +39. I hesitated before answering. A calm voice, accented, said, "Mr. Mercer, this is Marco. Your grandfather said you would come. The car will be waiting at Fiumicino Airport. Please bring the envelope." The line went dead. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the wind rustle through the hedges. It didn't make sense. My grandfather hadn't been to Italy in decades. The family knew nothing about any property there. That night, I sat in my small Denver apartment surrounded by unfinished sketches. The city lights blinked through the blinds. The laughter from earlier echoed faintly in my head. I looked at the ticket again. Rome. Part of me wanted to tear it in half, to let them be right, to accept that I was the forgotten grandson, the failure. But another part of me, the one that had sat beside Edward Mercer as he drew plans on napkins and spoke about creating things that lasted, wouldn't let me. I searched online for flights. The ticket was still valid, departing the next morning. I checked the seat assignment. Something strange. Originally economy, but the system now listed it as upgraded to first class. I hadn't changed anything. It was 1:12 a.m. when I finally decided. I packed a small bag, passport, sketchbook, and the crumpled envelope, and set the alarm for 5:30. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed years of small humiliations. Family dinners where I was the punchline, business meetings where Robert dismissed my ideas, even my father's quiet disappointment when I refused to join the company. The Mercers respected power, not persistence. But my grandfather had always been different. He'd tell me stories about his early days, about sleeping in construction trailers, eating canned beans while saving for land no one believed in. He used to say, "Daniel, they'll measure your worth by what you earn. Don't let them build something they can't." I never understood what he meant. Now, staring at that plane ticket under the dim kitchen light, I wondered if I was about to find out. The next morning, I arrived at Denver International long before dawn. The terminal was nearly empty, just the hum of cleaning machines and the distant echo of announcements. I handed my ticket to the attendant. She scanned it and frowned. "Interesting. Mr. Mercer, you've been upgraded to first class. Complimentary." "By who?" "No record of who authorized it," she said. "Just a note attached to your file. Confirmed by executor." I exhaled slowly. Whatever this was, my grandfather had planned it down to the smallest detail. As the plane taxied toward the runway, I looked out the window at the rising sun. For the first time in years, I felt something like anticipation. Not for wealth, not for revenge, but for understanding. Because whatever waited in Rome, I could feel it wasn't random. Edward Mercer had left his empire to those who worshipped power, but he'd left me something else, something hidden in plain sight. When the wheels lifted off the ground, I took out my sketchbook and drew the outline of a key inside a circle, the same shape that appeared in the corner of his old architectural blueprints. Maybe the real inheritance wasn't money at all. Maybe it was a test. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I drifted to sleep holding that thought. And when I woke up, the captain was announcing our descent into Rome. The first thing I saw through the window was sunlight on terracotta roofs, and for the first time since the funeral, I smiled. Whatever my grandfather had started, it was time to finish it. The plane touched down with a small jolt, and everyone around me suddenly came back to life. Seatbelts clicked, phone screens lit up, people started talking again. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the seat in front of me, feeling that strange mix of sleep and adrenaline. Rome. I had never been there. My passport only had a few stamps. School trip to Canada, one cheap vacation to Mexico with friends in college. That was it. My life had mostly been work, deadlines, and later, failure. Europe was something other people in my family did when they were bored with their usual expensive places. When we finally reached the gate and the doors opened, warm air hit me as I stepped into the jet bridge. It smelled different. Less air conditioning, more people, faint coffee, and something like dust and sun. The signs in the airport were half Italian, half English. I followed the flow, moving in slow steps through a long tunnel of glass that looked out over the runways. I felt like I was walking into one of my grandfather's stories. When I was a kid, he used to tell me about his early trips to Europe. He always said he came not to feel rich, but to feel small, so he would remember that the world was bigger than his company. I never understood why a man like that would want to feel small. Now I thought maybe he was trying to teach me something he knew the others would never care about. Immigration was calm. The officer barely glanced at me. He asked the usual questions, and I answered in short, practiced sentences. Tourism, 10 days, staying with a friend of my late grandfather. He stamped my passport, pushed it back, and waved me through. The baggage claim area was crowded. Families leaned on suitcases, kids chased each other around metal pillars. I watched my worn black bag come around the carousel and pulled it off. No one there knew my name, and that was almost a relief. Back home, my name came with weight. It came with questions about the company, about why I wasn't properly involved. I pushed the bag along and headed toward the exit signs. Before I stepped through the sliding glass doors, I stopped near a column and leaned my back against it. My arms suddenly felt heavy. The jet lag was part of it. The rest was 10 years of memories running through my head all at once. I thought about the first time someone in the family called me a disappointment to my face. I was 22, freshly graduated from architecture school, full of big ideas about sustainable design and public spaces that actually helped the people who used them. My father, who had spent his entire life in the shadow of my grandfather, asked if I was ready to do something serious now and come into Mercer Holdings. I told him I had an offer at a small architecture firm downtown instead. He said it was a cute hobby. He said I would grow out of it when I realized the real power was in owning the land, not drawing lines on paper. The rest of the family agreed. Some said it politely, some not so politely. My cousin Brandon told everyone I wanted to be an artist because I was too soft for business. That was the thing about that family. They could wrap cruelty and jokes so smoothly that people laughed along without noticing how sharp the edges were. The one person who never joined in was my grandfather. He came to my graduation alone, without the usual pack of relatives. He stood there in his gray suit that somehow looked more solid than anyone else's, and he handed me a leather-bound sketchbook. He said he wanted to see what I would build when no one was telling me how to do it. I remembered that night in his study when I was 15, sitting at his big oak desk with a ruler and a pencil. He was supposed to be on a call about a land deal, but he hung up early and asked what I was drawing. I told him I was trying to design a building that felt like a quiet place, even in the middle of a noisy city. He nodded and said real power was not always the tallest building or the biggest company. Sometimes, he said, it was the space you protected inside yourself, the one no one could buy. He never said things like that to anyone else, at least not that I saw. The first draft of my life went almost the way I hoped. I got hired at that small firm. There were long nights, low pay, and too much coffee, but I was happy. I worked on mixed-use projects, schools, a few community centers. I even won a local design award for a small library. At family dinners, they still asked when I would come to the real business. I always said maybe later. They took that as a joke. Then the firm took on a major project, an ambitious eco-friendly development on the edge of the city. It was the kind of project that could make a career. I put everything into it. Weekends, holidays, relationships. We depended on one major investor. That investor pulled out. The project stalled, then collapsed. The firm tried to stay alive on smaller contracts, but debts caught up. Within a year, it was done. We closed the office, and I left carrying a cardboard box with a few models and my old mug. The next family dinner was brutal. They said it proved their point. They said passion was a nice word until the bills arrived. Brandon told me at least I got to play with models before real life hit me. Robert suggested I could still have a future in the company if I was willing to start at the bottom like normal people, but everyone knew I would never be treated like a normal employee. I would always be the weak branch under the strong tree. The only person who acted differently was my grandfather. He called me to his study one afternoon. He asked what went wrong, and he listened, really listened, until I ran out of words. When I finished, he told me failure was not the opposite of success. Sometimes it was the door to it. He took out a folder with some of my old sketches, ones I barely remembered drawing. There was a design for a public plaza, a small museum, an art school. In shaky handwriting, he had written little notes in the margins, ideas, questions, even rough cost estimates. He said we should talk one day about building something together, something that did not have to answer to quarterly reports. Then he got sick, and that conversation never happened again. I thought about that now, as I stood in the Rome airport choking on fluorescent light and recycled air. Maybe this trip was his way of keeping that promise. Or maybe it was a final joke meant to teach me that idealism did not pay the bills. I really didn't know. What I did know was that back home, the will reading had already become a story. I could hear it in my head, the way Robert would repeat it to his friends. He would say his strange father had left a yacht to one grandchild and a plane ticket to the family disappointment. Brandon would add that at least I finally got somewhere fancy, even if it was economy class. I took out the envelope again. The paper was more worn than I remembered, like it had been handled over and over. There was no letter, no extra card, just the stub from the ticket and my name written in my grandfather's careful hand on the inside flap. Daniel. He had written it once, then gone over it again, pressing harder. I slid it back into my jacket and pushed off the column. It was time to step outside. The sliding doors opened, and Rome hit me all at once. Warm air, car exhaust, horns, people speaking rapid Italian into phones. Drivers stood in a loose line holding signs with names in big black letters. Taxis formed a chaotic line. Somewhere, someone laughed too loudly. Somewhere else, a child cried. I rolled my suitcase to the side and scanned the signs. Most of them were printed. Some were on tablets. Near the end of the line, one man held a handwritten sign. He looked about 40, maybe a bit older, with dark hair starting to go gray at the temples and a simple black jacket. His sign was not printed. It was written in thick marker. Mr. Daniel Mercer, villa appointment. He held it like it was normal, like he did this every day. For a second, I just watched him. My heart was beating faster now, like I was about to step onto a stage I had not rehearsed for. The driver looked around the crowd, his eyes moving over faces, then back to the sign. He did not seem surprised. He seemed patient. I took a breath and started walking toward him, each step feeling like it was carrying me further away from the version of myself my family thought they knew. Before I reached him, something sharp cut through the noise above my head. The airport loudspeaker clicked on, and an announcement came in Italian first, then English. The English voice said my name clearly, asked me to proceed to the private arrivals area. I stopped. People near me glanced around but went back to their own business. The driver with the handwritten sign looked up, met my eyes, then gave a small nod, like this was exactly what he expected. He lowered the sign and gestured for me to follow him, saying my grandfather had planned everything and that the car was waiting. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase and moved toward him, feeling the old life in Denver fall away with each step. The driver led me through a smaller side door away from the main crowd. The noise of the airport faded as soon as it closed behind us. We moved down a quiet hallway with pale walls and low lights, the kind of space that feels like it exists between worlds. He walked with an easy, steady pace, like he had done this many times before. When we reached a private exit, he stopped beside a dark sedan and introduced himself as Marco. He said he had worked for my grandfather for many years, first in the company and later as caretaker of the villa outside the city. He also said my grandfather had called him a month before he died and told him to be ready for my arrival. That part made my throat tighten. I put my bag in the trunk and slid into the back seat. The leather was worn, but clean. As we pulled away from the airport, the chaos of taxis and buses fell behind us. The road opened into a long stretch of highway, lined with trees and billboards in Italian. For a few minutes, we drove in silence. I watched the buildings change, concrete, then low houses, then hills. The sky was a clear blue I almost never saw in Denver. Marco finally broke the silence. He said my grandfather had spoken about me more often than about anyone else in the family. He told me Edward had said I was the only one who still thought in lines and weights instead of numbers on a balance sheet. I asked how often they had spoken. Marco said that in the last 5 years, my grandfather called at least once a month. He told me Edward always asked about the villa, the olive trees, the repairs. He never mentioned bringing any of my cousins. Only me. I pressed my palm against my knee to steady it. I remembered thinking my grandfather's world had shrunk after his health began to fail. Maybe it had not. Maybe it had just shifted. The city faded behind us. We drove past small towns and stone farmhouses. The road narrowed and began to curve. On our left, a glimpse of water appeared. A lake, wide and calm, catching bits of sun. Marco pointed it out and said the villa stood on the hill above that lake. He told me my grandfather used to call it his breathing room, the one place where he felt like a man instead of a symbol. It hit me then. I had been here before. The memories came back slow and blurry. One summer when I was 11, I had flown with my grandparents to Europe. There were old stone walls, warm air at night, fireflies, the steady hum of cicadas. I remembered running down a terrace lined with terracotta pots while my grandmother called for me to slow down. I remembered my grandfather laughing in a way he rarely did at home. I had spent 3 weeks here. Then my grandmother died the following year, and we never returned. As we climbed the hill, the air changed. It grew cooler and smelled faintly of pine and dust. The car turned through an iron gate that creaked just enough to remind me how long it had stood there. The villa appeared around a bend. It was not huge in the way my family measured things, but it had weight. 2 stories of pale stone, climbing vines on the walls, green shutters half open. A gravel drive curved in front of it. Olive trees stood like quiet guards. I stepped out of the car and just stood there for a moment. The place felt familiar and strange at the same time, like seeing an old friend after decades and noticing both what had changed and what had not. Marco watched me, his expression careful. He said the villa had been maintained exactly as my grandfather requested. Nothing large was altered without his approval. He told me Edward had insisted the house remain a home, not a museum. The front door was solid wood, scarred in places, polished in others. Marco unlocked it and pushed it open. Cool air greeted us inside, carrying hints of old paper, faint citrus, and something I could not name but recognized anyway. The entry hall had a black and white tiled floor and simple wooden furniture. No gold, no massive chandeliers. My grandfather could have filled this place with all the expensive things he liked to show off at the mansion in Denver. Instead, it felt almost modest. The wealth here was in the walls. Marco said my room was prepared upstairs. He offered to carry my bag, but I shook my head and took it myself. He nodded like he expected that answer. On the second floor, the guest room had tall windows that looked out over the lake. The bed was covered with a simple white spread. A wardrobe stood in the corner. On the small desk by the window, I saw an object that made me stop. It was a sketchbook, the same brand my grandfather had given me years ago. Next to it lay a pencil, sharpened but unused. I touched the cover with my fingertips. Marco said my grandfather had asked him to put it there the day he learned his cancer was terminal. He had said I might want to draw again. I swallowed and forced myself to breathe slowly. The villa was not just a place I had been sent. It was a message. After unpacking, I washed my face and went back downstairs. Marco was waiting near the door to the back terrace. He asked if I wanted to see the rest of the house. I nodded. We moved through the rooms, simple living room, dining room with a long wooden table, kitchen with stone counters and open shelves. Everything felt used, not staged. A faint groove in the back of a chair where someone sat often, a burn mark near the stove, a stack of mismatched plates that looked like they had been gathered one by one over years. When we reached a door at the far end of the hall, Marco paused. He said this room was my grandfather's favorite. He added that he had strict orders to leave it locked unless I asked to see it. He took a key from his pocket, set it in the lock, and turned it. The sound of the mechanism sliding open was strangely loud. The room was a library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves covered 2 walls lined with books in English and Italian. A large window looked out over the lake. A heavy wooden desk sat in the center, its surface almost empty except for a brass lamp and a small stack of papers. I stepped inside slowly. Dust motes floated in the light from the window. The air smelled like paper, ink, and a hint of tobacco. My grandfather must have spent hours here. Marco stayed near the doorway. He said this room was the one my grandfather mentioned most. He told me Edward had called it his second mind. On the wall to the right of the desk hung a large framed portrait of my grandparents. I remembered the photo it was based on, a black and white picture of them standing on a job site long before I was born. Here, painted in muted colors, they looked younger than I had ever seen them, standing together with hard hats under their arms, staring toward a future they were still building. I went to the desk. There were only 3 things on it: a leather blotter, a fountain pen, and a single sheet of paper with my name written at the top in my grandfather's handwriting. My heart started beating faster again. I picked up the paper. It was not a letter, not really. It was more like a note. Short sentences, each one simple. He wrote that if I was reading this, then I had followed the ticket instead of throwing it away. He wrote that he knew the others would laugh, because they could not imagine any value that did not come with a number attached. He wrote that what he wanted to leave me was not a yacht or an apartment, but a choice. He said the rest of what I needed was already in the room. The note ended with a lane I knew well. He had said it many times when we talked about buildings and life. He wrote that integrity builds what greed destroys. My hand tightened around the page. For a second, I just stood there, letting the meaning sink in. The funeral suddenly felt like one small scene in a much longer story. I looked around the room again, this time more carefully. The shelves, the corners, the shadows. Near the shelves on the left, I noticed an uneven patch on the wall. The paint was slightly different. I moved closer and saw it was not the wall at all. It was a panel. A small metal button was hidden along the side. I pressed it, expecting resistance. Instead, the panel clicked and swung open on silent hinges. Behind it was a small safe, dark gray, with a simple dial and keyhole. Marco cleared his throat softly. He said my grandfather had given him a key years ago and said he was never to use it himself. He pulled a small ring from his pocket and handed it to me. The key was old brass, worn smooth where fingers had held it many times. He stepped to the door and said he would give me privacy. Then he left, closing the library door behind him. The house went silent. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The safe opened without effort. Inside, there were no stacks of cash, no jewels, nothing that would interest the rest of my family. There were 3 items: a sealed envelope, a small metal key of a different shape, and a thin folder tied with string. I took out the envelope first. On the front, in his handwriting again, was my name, and beneath it, a single sentence telling me not to open it until I had spoken to a woman named Clara in Rome. I set it down carefully. The small metal key had a different cut, longer and more complex. It looked like a key for a gate or a storage room, not a house door. I turned it over in my fingers, wondering what it opened. Finally, I lifted out the folder. The paper felt heavy, like old official stock. On the front, in block letters, was a title written in English. The words were simple, but made my chest tighten all over again. The label on the folder read, Foundation, Final Draft. I stared at the label on the folder until the letters blurred. Foundation, Final Draft. It wasn't Mercer Holdings. It wasn't some project code. It was written in my grandfather's hand, on a folder hidden in his private safe in a villa no one seemed to talk about anymore. I set it on the desk and forced myself to breathe. For a second, I thought about how my family would react if they knew I was standing here. Brandon would joke that I'd found the secret stash of Grandpa's bad investments. Robert would demand that I ship everything back to Denver for proper review. They had no idea this place even mattered. I slid the string off and opened the folder. Inside were several sheets of paper, all in English, some typed, some with handwritten notes in the margins. There were dates in the top corners. The earliest was from 3 years ago. The most recent was from 6 months before his death. The first page looked like an outline, headings, bullet points. Purpose, structure, governance. It sounded like the skeleton of some kind of foundation, just like the label said. My eyes traced phrases as I skimmed. Independent of Mercer Holdings. Dedicated to public architecture, art, and education. Managed by Board of Trustees, initial chair, DM. I stopped at those 2 letters. DM. My initials. It could have been anyone, I told myself. But in this room, in this house, in this folder with my name on the envelope, it felt like there was only one answer. I flipped through more pages. There were rough descriptions of a physical space, gallery, workshop area, classrooms, courtyard. The sketches tucked in among the text hit me harder than the words. They were mine. Not exact copies, but undeniably based on my old designs. Curved walkways, open squares lined with trees, indoor spaces flooded with natural light. Some were almost identical to a project I had done in school. Others were variations on a library design I had once daydreamed about but never fully drew. My lines, my ideas, but reworked, annotated in his handwriting. He had been studying them. In the margins, he'd written comments like check local zoning and talk to CR about trust structure. Next to one diagram, he'd scribbled, Dan said this should feel like a quiet place in a noisy city. Listen to him. My chest tightened. For years, I thought my grandfather only listened politely when I talked about architecture. I thought it was something he humored, the way you indulge a child's hobby. But these pages proved something else. He hadn't just listened. He'd planned around it. I didn't let myself read further. Not yet. There was a rule on the envelope, and my grandfather did not throw words around lightly. Do not open until you speak to Clara, he had written, and he had mentioned someone with initials CR in the margins. Clara, CR. It fit too easily. I gathered the folder, the letter, and the small metal key, then locked the safe again. The sound of the door closing had a final quality, like I was sealing a chapter I would come back to only when I was ready. When I stepped out of the library, the light in the hall had shifted. Afternoon was fading into evening. Soft shadows stretched across the floor. Marco was waiting at the end of the hallway, not close enough to eavesdrop, just present. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. He must have been that way around my grandfather, too. Did you find what he wanted you to find? He asked. I thought about the folder, the sketches, the initials. I thought about how my family back home were probably still arguing over percentages and seats on the board. I found enough to know I need answers, I said. He nodded like that was the right answer. He told me dinner would be ready soon if I was hungry, and that the village below had a small cafe if I preferred to get out of the house. I chose the cafe. I needed air that wasn't full of old paper and heavy memory. We drove down the hill in the fading light. The village was small, with narrow streets and stone buildings stacked together like they were sharing secrets. People sat outside at small tables, talking with their hands, sipping coffee and wine, children running around their feet. We stopped at a cafe near the square. Marco told me he'd be back in an hour and left me at a small table under a striped awning. The waiter spoke enough English for us to understand each other. I ordered a coffee, then added a sandwich when I realized I hadn't eaten since the plane. For a while, I just watched people. No one cared who I was. No one knew the Mercer name here. To them, I was just another traveler with messy hair and tired eyes, nursing a coffee and trying to make sense of something. I took out my phone and opened my messages. There were missed calls and texts from Denver. One from my father. Call when you land. We need to discuss your behavior. Behavior. Like accepting a plane ticket was an act of rebellion. Several from Brandon. The first two were mock concern. Hey, world traveler, how's the charity trip? Then one more sharp. Uncle Robert wants to know why the lawyer said you had European matters to attend to. You been hiding something, cousin? I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my email and searched the name Clara, then added Rome. Nothing. I tried CR Law Rome. Dozens of results. I narrowed it with Mercer. Only one hit. A scanned PDF in my grandfather's old documents that mentioned Rossi and Partners, Rome. Handled European property acquisitions. Rossi. CR Clara Rossi. It felt right. I looked up law firms with that name. There were a few, some out of date. One in particular stood out. A small firm specializing in estates and trusts, located in a district not far from the city center. My coffee went cold as I scribbled the address into my sketchbook. When Marco returned, I asked if he knew a lawyer named Rossi. His eyebrows lifted, and he smiled for the first time that day. Signora Clara? He said. Of course. Your grandfather trusted her more than most people. He said she remembered he was a man before she remembered he was rich. That sounded like my grandfather's way of giving the highest possible compliment. Marco said Clara's office was in Rome proper, not far from the river. He offered to drive me the next morning. I agreed. Back at the villa that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the bed listening to the soft noises of the old house. Wood creaking, distant wind, the faint rhythm of water from the lake below. My mind kept replaying lines from the foundation folder. Independent of Mercer Holdings, dedicated to public spaces. Initial chair, DM. It didn't feel real. It felt like some alternate version of my life that might have happened if we'd had more time, if his health had held, if I hadn't failed so visibly in front of the family's watching eyes. Part of me wondered if I really deserved whatever this was supposed to be. Then I remembered his note. He hadn't written about my success. He'd written about my choices. I got up, grabbed the sketchbook from the desk, and went to sit by the window. The moon laid a faint path across the dark water. I opened the book and, without thinking too hard, started to draw. Lines became walls, then arches, then an open courtyard with trees arranged to break noise from the street. I sketched people walking, sitting, leaning against railings. I drew children running in a space that felt safe, adults talking in corners that felt private but not hidden. By the time I stopped, a whole complex filled 2 pages. The rough shape looked a lot like some of the sketches in the folder. Or maybe they looked like this. Maybe he had been waiting for me to come back to this exact idea. The next morning, Marco drove us into Rome just after dawn. The light turned the stone buildings golden. The streets grew more crowded the closer we got to the center. Scooters weaved between cars. People carried briefcases and baguettes and bouquets of flowers all at once. Clara's office was in an old building near a narrow street with a small plaque by the door. No big logo, no shiny glass, just a name etched in metal. Rossi and Partners. Marco waited in the car while I went in. The lobby was simple. Wooden chairs, a potted plant, a small desk where a receptionist sat. She greeted me in Italian, then switched smoothly to English when she saw my face. Appointment? She asked. I hesitated. No, my name is Daniel Mercer. I think Ms. Rossi knew my grandfather, Edward. Her expression changed. She motioned to a chair and picked up the phone. A quick conversation in Italian followed. A moment later, she said, "She will see you now," and led me down a short hallway. Clara was in her 50s, with short, dark hair streaked with gray and clear, sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her office had a window that looked out over a quiet courtyard, shelves of color-coded binders, and a small table with a coffee pot and cups. She stood and shook my hand. Her grip was firm. "You have his eyes," she said first, "not hello." Then she gestured for me to sit, and I told her why I was there, about the funeral, the ticket, the villa. I did not mention the folder in detail yet, only that I had found something that mentioned a foundation and had seen her initials. Clara listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Your grandfather was a difficult client," she said. "Stubborn, impatient, but unlike most of my rich clients, he understood why the law exists. He believed in rules, even the ones that limited him." That sounded right. She walked to one of the shelves, pulled down a binder with a label that only read MEM on EU, brought it back to the desk, and opened it. Inside were tabs with dates, country names, property codes. "I have been expecting this visit," she said. "He told me that when you arrived in Rome, you would come here. He did not know if it would be 1 month after his death or 10 years. He only asked that I keep certain matters prepared." "What matters?" I asked. She closed the binder again before I could see more. "We will discuss details soon," she said. "For now I need to confirm your identity and your intentions. Are you here to fight your family, or to understand what your grandfather tried to build?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about Brandon's texts, Robert's message, the laughter at the will reading. "I'm here to understand," I said. "Whatever he started, I want to know what it was. After that, I'll decide." Clara studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. He said you would answer like that." She reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope, similar to the one I had, but thicker. My name was written on it in bold, neat handwriting I recognized instantly. "This," she said, placing it in front of me, "was left with me to give you when you came. You also have one in the villa, yes?" I nodded. "He told me not to open it until I spoke to you." "He was very particular about timing," she said with a faint smile. "You may open yours now, but not here." I frowned. "Why not?" "Because when you open it," she said, "things will begin that cannot be easily undone. And it is better you are somewhere that feels like yours, not mine." She slid a card across the desk as well. It had the date and time printed on it in precise black ink. "Tomorrow evening," she said, "there is an event at a gallery in the city. Your family does not yet know about it. Your presence is expected. It concerns the foundation. Until then, look around the villa. Read what he left you, but do not show anything to anyone yet." I took the card. The event name was printed in small letters at the top. Mercer European Art Foundation, Introductory Exhibition. My throat went dry. "Art Foundation," I said quietly. "More than that," Clara replied. "But yes, that is the name he chose in the end. He had other ideas, but he kept coming back to this one." I slipped the card into my pocket and stood. "Clara," I said, "does my family know any of this exists?" She shook her head. "They know what was read in Denver. That is all. This," she tapped the closed binder, "is a different story, one he wrote very carefully." On the drive back to the villa, I watched the city slide past, my mind racing. There was a binder in Clara's office full of whatever my grandfather had built. There were sketches and notes in the villa library that tied my ideas to his plan. There was an invitation in my pocket to an event carrying the name Mercer in a city none of my relatives cared about unless it had shopping. The foundation was real, and it was about to step into the light. As we pulled through the iron gate of the villa again, I saw something new. An envelope lay on the small table just inside the front door, heavy cream paper with my name on it, delivered by hand. No postage, no return address. I picked it up. Inside was a single card, the same as the one Clara had given me, but with one extra line written in black ink at the bottom in Italian. Marco translated it quietly over my shoulder. "It says," he murmured, "your presence is required, not requested." I stood there in the dim entry hall, holding the card, feeling the weight of those words. Whatever my grandfather had set in motion, it was moving now. The card sat on the entry table like it weighed more than paper. I turned it over in my hand a few times, even though there was nothing on the back. Same printed text as the first one, same logo at the top with my grandfather's initials woven into the name of the foundation. Only this time there was that extra handwritten line, saying my presence was required, not requested. That sounded exactly like him. Marco watched me quietly. He didn't ask what the card said. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he didn't need to. He just told me that lunch was in the kitchen if I wanted it, and that he'd be near the garage doing repairs. The house went still when he left. Old houses make their own noise, but underneath that, there was a kind of waiting feeling, like the villa itself understood something was about to change. I took the card and the envelope from Clara's office up to the library. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting long shapes on the floor. Dust drifted lazily in the air. On the desk, I laid everything out in a row. Clara's card, the card that had appeared at the door, the sealed envelope from the safe, and the note my grandfather had left on the blotter. His handwriting was steady even in the last months. That calmed me more than I wanted to admit. It meant whatever he had done with a clear head. He'd told me in the note that the rest of what I needed was already in the room. Clara had told me not to open the envelope until after I spoke to her. I had spoken to her now. She had told me to open it somewhere that felt like mine, not hers. This room was as close as I was going to get to that. My fingers shook a little as I slid them under the flap. Inside was a thick stack of folded pages and a single, smaller card. I read the card first. It told me to breathe and not to panic at the numbers. That sounded like him, too. The pages were a letter, handwritten, longer than anything he had ever written to me. I read it slowly, line by line. He explained things I'd only guessed before. He wrote that years ago, when my grandmother died, he realized his children were already formed into the kind of people they would be. Sharp, hungry, measuring everything in gain and loss. He didn't say it like an insult. He just described it as a fact. He wrote that he had no intention of punishing them for being who they were. He'd built a machine, and they had learned how to run it. The company was theirs now, in every way that counted. But he also wrote that a machine was not a legacy. The foundation had started as a vague idea, he said, the day I showed him a drawing of a public square with trees arranged like a shield against noise. I had been 16. He claimed he had understood then that there was a different kind of power in creating spaces where people felt human instead of useful. This was his way of explaining that the folder labeled Foundation Final Draft was not a fantasy or a sentimental project. It was something he'd funded quietly for years. Land purchased, structures negotiated with the city, early paperwork filed through Clara's office. He did not go into detail about the legal side. He only said that the documents existed, were complete, and did not rely on my family's approval. Then the letter turned to me. He said he knew what the others thought of me. He said he'd heard the jokes, the word disappointment thrown around in rooms where people thought he wasn't listening. He wrote that he had allowed it, on purpose, because it helped him see everyone's true colors. He told me he had chosen me for the foundation not because I was his favorite, but because I was the only one who still listened more than he talked. He said the plane ticket was not a test of obedience, but a test of trust. My trust in myself more than in him. If I had ignored it, he wrote, the foundation would still exist. Clara would direct it with a different board, the work would go on. But if I came, it meant I was willing to stand in the light as myself, not as the failed grandson they described. He ended the letter with instructions. He told me to attend the event. He told me I didn't need to say much, that the real words would already be prepared. He told me to remember one thing when the others reacted the way he knew they would. They respected power, but they feared proof. He wrote that the foundation was built according to the rules they themselves loved to use. Contracts, jurisdictions, filings, signatures. No shortcuts, no fraud, no loopholes. He said that in the end, they would have to accept it not because they wanted to, but because the system they worshipped said they had no choice. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, then sat very still. The anger I'd been carrying since the funeral had cooled into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet. More like a strange clarity, the feeling of seeing the whole board in a game I'd thought I'd already lost. For years, I'd been trying to prove I belonged in a family that measured worth in quarterly profits and assets. Now I saw that my grandfather had quietly moved the center of gravity somewhere else. For the first time since I landed, I started to think about my own part in all this, not just as a passive receiver. He had set up the structure. I would have to live inside it. I spent the next few hours reading through the foundation folder properly. I obeyed his limits. I didn't dig for the formal legal copies, didn't ask Clara yet for the full binders. But the drafts told me enough. There were sections about the mission, supporting public architecture, art education, community spaces in underfunded areas. There were notes about partnerships with local universities, residency programs for young designers, grants for projects that would never pass a traditional cost-benefit analysis. My name appeared in the governance section more than once. It used phrases like founding director and lifetime appointment subject to voluntary resignation. It also mentioned a board of trustees from outside the family, artists, architects, legal advisors, community leaders. My relatives were not listed anywhere. That, more than anything, made my lips press into a tight line. He hadn't just given me something, he had kept them out on purpose. By the time the sun dipped low and the room grew darker, my brain felt overheated. I closed the folder, turned off the desk lamp, and went to find Marco. He was outside near the garage, cleaning tools. The sky over the lake had turned pink, then purple. Lights were starting to come on in the village below. I told him I'd be going into the city again tomorrow evening for the event. I also asked him a question I'd been holding back. I asked if any of my relatives had ever been to the villa after my grandmother died. He said they had not. He said my grandfather liked to keep different parts of his life separate. Business in Denver, family dinners in the mansion, quiet work, and thinking at the villa. He said Edward had once told him the villa was for people who could stand silence without reaching for their phones. That sounded about right. That night, I called home. I didn't call my father, I called Robert. He answered on the second ring, his voice already carrying that smooth tone he used in board meetings. He asked how my little trip was going. He said he hoped I was enjoying the view. I told him I was in Rome on Mercer family business. There was a pause, small but sharp. He asked what that meant. I said there was an event the next evening using our name, that I believed it related to something our grandfather had set up. He asked why no one in Denver knew about it. I told him maybe they hadn't been meant to. His voice hardened then. He said I needed to remember that anything involving the Mercer name, especially overseas, was his business as CEO. He asked for details: who, where, what. I gave him only what was already on the card, the public information. I could almost hear him typing on a keyboard as we talked, searching, calculating, getting nervous. He ended the call by telling me, in that calm warning tone, that family didn't keep secrets from each other. I said as far as I could tell, they'd been doing that to me for years. When I hung up, my hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I thought about calling him back and apologizing, the old habit kicking in, but I didn't. Instead, I turned my phone off and left it on the desk. The next day moved like a slow wave. I walked the grounds of the villa in the morning, tracing paths my younger self had run along. I found an old stone bench half hidden under ivy and sat there for a long time, watching the water. I thought about the kids who might one day sit in a courtyard I helped design, the students who might attend workshops funded by a foundation my family didn't believe in, because it didn't make them richer. I thought about my cousins. Brandon would see this as theft, not as a separate inheritance. To him, all things with the Mercer name belonged to the Mercer Empire. The idea that something could exist under that name without feeding the company would offend him on a basic level. By afternoon, my mind was settled. I couldn't control their reactions. I could only decide how I would stand when it happened. Around 5, I put on the same suit I'd worn to the funeral. It felt different now. Back then, it had been something like armor against humiliation. Now it felt like a uniform for a different kind of battle, one fought with documents and signatures instead of raised voices. Marco drove me into the city again as the sun dipped, casting long shadows along the buildings. Traffic thickened near the center. As we approached the gallery address on the card, I saw signs of preparation, lights being tested, cables taped down, staff adjusting small details. The building itself looked like something I'd once drawn. Old stone facade, tall windows, a modern glass addition at the back that hinted at a courtyard beyond. It sat on a corner, catching the evening light just right. A banner hung over the entrance. Mercer European Art Foundation, Introductory Exhibition. Spaces that hold us. Seeing my family name next to those words made something tight in my chest loosen just a little. Marco pulled up to the curb and stopped. He turned to me and said my grandfather had visited this building once, years ago, and had stood outside for a long time just looking at it. Marco said he had mentioned that one day something important with his name would happen there. I stepped out of the car. There were already a few people gathered near the entrance, staff in black, early guests in good jackets, a photographer adjusting his camera. I noticed a familiar shape near the steps and felt my jaw clench. Robert stood there, talking to a woman holding a clipboard, his expression tight. Brandon hovered beside him, pretending to be relaxed while his eyes darted around, taking everything in like a shark measuring distance. They hadn't wasted any time. Robert saw me and his expression sharpened. He broke off his conversation and walked toward me with a measured stride. Brandon followed, just a step behind. As he approached, I realized something simple and cold. For once, I wasn't the one walking into their world. They were walking into mine. Robert said we needed to talk before anything started. He wanted to know exactly what was going on, what this foundation nonsense was, and why he hadn't been consulted. I told him calmly that once we were inside, all his questions would be answered, and that tonight, for once, the explanations were not going to come from me. He didn't like that. I could see it in the way his mouth tightened, but there were people watching, staff nearby, a photographer raising his camera. He cared too much about image to risk a public scene. Not yet. Brandon leaned in and muttered something about me playing games I didn't understand. I just looked at him and thought about how many contracts, filings, and signatures sat between his assumptions and the truth. Inside, the gallery lights glowed warm. I could hear the faint clink of glasses and the low murmur of early guests. A coordinator approached and said the presentation would begin in 20 minutes. She gestured toward the main hall, where rows of chairs faced a stage backed by a large screen displaying the foundation's logo. I walked past my uncle and cousin without waiting for them to follow. As I crossed the threshold into the main hall, the noise faded under the hum of the equipment. A technician adjusted the microphone. Someone tested the projector. The logo flickered, then settled again. My grandfather's initials glowed at the center of the screen. I took a seat in the second row, right in the middle, where I could see both the stage and the faces that would soon fill the room. Behind me, I heard the doors close with a soft click, shutting out the street. The lights near the stage dimmed a little, and the screen brightened, holding the logo steady. Somewhere off to the side, I saw Clara step into view, her papers in hand, speaking quietly with a man in a dark suit. She caught my eye for a brief moment and gave the smallest nod, as if to say that everything was in place. Then the house lights dipped again. The murmurs in the crowd softened. On the screen, the logo faded to black, and my grandfather's recorded voice began to speak. My grandfather's voice rolled out over the speakers calm and steady, like he was sitting in his Denver study instead of on a screen in a Roman gallery. He explained that he was speaking from a year before his death, after reviewing his life and the people who would survive him. He said his children had inherited his company and his hunger, and that he had no wish to take that from them. Then, he said, a corporation could not be a soul, and he refused to let his name die as only a logo. He told the audience he had created the Mercer European Art Foundation as a separate legal trust under Italian jurisdiction. He said all European properties in his name, liquid assets, and designated investment accounts had been transferred into it. He noted that the trust was irrevocable and fully funded. Then he said the foundation needed a spine, not a mouth, and that he had chosen his grandson, Daniel Mercer, as founding director and lifetime chair, answerable only to the board and the law. My name filled the hall. People turned in their seats. I felt Robert go rigid behind me. Brandon made a small sound like he'd swallowed wrong. On screen, my grandfather said his family in Denver had not been consulted on this matter because they had already received their inheritance. He said this part of his legacy was for the cities, the students, the people who would never sit in a boardroom. He finished by saying that if anyone wished to challenge it, they were welcome to test the strength of the contracts he had signed with his own hand. The video faded. Clara stepped to the podium and announced in clear, measured words that the trust was registered, the documents filed, and the foundation now formally active with me as director. Flashbulbs popped. Guests began to applaud. Robert did not. When I stood, Clara handed me a slim folder, my appointment stamped and sealed. Behind me, my uncle and cousin stayed frozen in their seats, staring at a future they no longer controlled.